Hello everyone, welcome to another law problem question video. This is a paper 4 problem question from the OCR syllabus, a past paper from a few years ago. So it's contract law and the topic area is consideration. Now it might be worth possibly pausing the video at this point and having a look at the scenario if you haven't already. The bolded words are ones that I've added. The examiner won't do that for you, unfortunately, but it's the sort of thing you might do when you read the scenario and you either underline or highlight or make a few scribbled notes to help you then return to it as you start your answer. So as you can see, there are 3 elements to this problem question, 3 things that are going on. And then the question is, advise whether there has been good consideration in those various contracts. There's 3 of them. It's a typical consideration problem question. You might get 2 or 3 things going on, and the examiner wants you to discuss whether there has actually been consideration. All very predictable. If you know your consideration law, it's not a huge topic. I'm just going to show you how you might lay out a A-grade answer. With contract law, I always tend to recommend what I call the 50-50 approach, which is where you begin by just explaining the AO1 in a sort of essay form, as if that's all you're going to do. So the AO1 for this would just be explaining that relevant topic area. You just need to do a little essay, 250 or so words, covering this topic. The AO1 ideally, I mean, sometimes there's always a risk that the AO1 might be a bit too long if it's a large topic area. Ideally, your AO1 should reflect the law in the scenario for a perfect approach. Sometimes you might add a few things which aren't actually going on in the scenario simply because it's relevant to that topic, but examiners prefer you to detail the AO1 that you're going to be using in the later AO2. I call it 50-50 because don't be too specific about the mathematics there. Obviously, the AO1 is 8 marks and the AO2 is 12 marks, so it's not quite equal or 50-50. But by 50-50, I just mean that you start by just doing a big block of AO1 and then follow it with the other half of your answer, if you like, and that's the AO2. So I always think that works better with contract law, unlike the other topic areas. If you're doing, for instance, a tort paper, you might be doing a question on Rylands versus Fletcher or nuisance, occupiers liability or negligence, and they're all very structured in the sense that you might use what I call the bit by bit approach, where you say a bit of law and then you apply the relevant bit of application for the AO2, and you do this bit by bit approach where every bit of law that you quote you then apply the AO2. I just think with contract law it doesn't quite work as well if you do that approach. There's nothing wrong with it, but it might be better to just blast off all the AO1 and then follow it up with the AO2 that was relevant to those points. Anyway, let's have a look at the question itself. So the way I would approach this is obviously beginning with the AO1, and what you need to do is a reasonable little essay on what consideration is. And it's always good to start an answer with the general definition of the topic area. So here we might quote the Dunlop versus Selfridge quote. It might be a bit of waffle, it might not mean a lot, it might not make much sense, but it's the traditional way to start an answer by just quoting and beginning with the relevant source of the definition, if you like, or something like that. It's like we do in criminal law. We might quote the act and section of a crime and then go on and break down the actus reus and mens rea. In Rylands versus Fletcher, you might begin with the quote from Judge Blackburn on generally what Rylands versus Fletcher involves. And in nuisance, you might quote a similar definition. If you're doing a crime problem question on murder, you might begin with the common law definition from Lord Cook. If you're doing a theft question, you might begin by quoting section 1 of the Theft Act. So it's good practice to just begin with a general outline of the law itself. And then what you need to do, and I've done it here, is just explain the various requirements of this area of contract law. So first thing you might talk about is that consideration must not be passed. And if you've done some work on this, that will be familiar to you. And you can briefly explain that. And there at the end, look, you can quote the relevant case. Any exceptions to that rule? To pass consideration, which might be from a previous request, you can explain and throw in the case, often just in brackets at the end of the sentence where you've quoted the law. And a further exception is this business context, where obviously there's a understanding and a presumption that it will be paid for, then past consideration is valid. That's the Casey's Patents case. You can then quote this classic consideration must be sufficient but doesn't need to be adequate from Chappell versus Nestle, and briefly explain what that means. The public duty requirement. Someone's doing a bit existing public duty, then that's not sufficient consideration because they're doing it anyway. There's an exception to that in the fact that they might exceed that duty. And the contractual duty as well, the classic Stilt versus Myrick case. So there is a typical AO1 with the basic rules of consideration, and any exceptions to those rules. That's probably about 300 words. That would give you close to 8 marks, if not 8 marks out of the 8 for your basic essay. And that's your AO1, and that gets you going. I mean, doing the AO1 first in one big block like this also reminds you of the topic area, and while you're doing it, you're sort of thinking about the scenario that you've already read, and you're already starting to plan and formulate what you're going to do with this law. So with hopefully 8 marks in the bag at this point out of your 20, you need to try and get your other 12 from the AO2. And what we're going to do here is look at the first of the 3 scenarios, and it's the bit highlighted here in green where Sally's organising this Christmas party at the athletics club. The manager of a local leisure centre says that she can have a room for free to have this party because she's been such a good customer all year. And having done the AO1, you're already thinking, hang on a minute, is this a past consideration issue? Hopefully that will have gone into your mind at this point, and then you can start to deal with that. So how do we deal with the AO2? And you may have noticed that all that AO1 on the previous slide was all in yellow. I tend to colour code my problem question answers for students' benefit. Obviously you wouldn't do that in reality, but anything in yellow means AO1, particularly stands out if you're doing this bit by bit approach. And then any AO2 in response to that bit of law, I colour code in green. So having done all that AO1, we can now start to pull the answer together. And the first point you could make is that when the manager is offering this room for free, you might say it's some sort of gratuitous promise at this point. But the first observation there is he's providing good consideration in that he is promising the room, and in a sense he's done his bit when it comes to consideration. But the however is, there was a nice little however for these questions, is when she accepts that room that he's offering her, she's providing nothing to him in the form of consideration, because the thing that sort of motivated him in giving this free room is something she's already done. So this is a classic past consideration issue. So by pointing that out, it's that Ray McCardle case again. You can basically say he's done his bit, he's offered some consideration in the form of the room, but her acceptance doesn't contain any consideration because what she's already done is past. So there's your first point, and that's that first issue already dealt with. You can then look for any exceptions. They may be present in the scenario. In this case there aren't, but you could say, perhaps there was a previous request, perhaps there is one in a scenario that you might come across. And that's that Lampley versus Braithwaite case where there was some sort of previous request or promise that if you do something, then you can expect something in return. But that's not happening. We can point that out. It just gives us a little bit more to say. And then you can do a little conclusion there at the end to say the agreement is not or appears not to be legally binding. So that then provides you with your first bit of AO2 for the first scenario. And it's quite simple. The second bit is where she books this band to play music at the party, and then when when they realise how far they will have to travel, they try and cancel the contract. She's unable to replace them, so she offers them extra payment. Okay, and again, if you've studied this topic in reasonable detail, you're saying to yourself, I know what they're doing here, and I need to sort of relate the law to that. And the first bit of AO2 for this section, and your answer continues, is that we originally begin with consideration from Sally in the form of payment or a promise of payment, and the band equally provide consideration with their promise of performance. So it all starts well, and we've got a an agreement at this point by the look of it. But then you do the magical however. However's a great in problem question because it allows you to sort of discuss other alternatives and take the reader in a slightly different direction. And the problem here, of course, is that when they threaten to pull out of this contract, potentially breach the contract, she in response, getting a bit desperate for their services, offers them extra money. So she's now providing an additional form of consideration by offering to pay them more. But then they don't do anything in response to that additional consideration, because all they're doing is agreeing to do what they've already agreed to do. And of course, that's Stilk versus Myrick, classic case, the sailors who were asked to sail home in the absence of some of their other crew members, so they sort of worked harder, if you like, and when they got home, the captain didn't give them the extra money that he'd promised because they'd got to sail home anyway, because that was in their original agreement. So the next point here is that the band aren't doing anything to seal that deal, if you like, by offering any consideration of their own for the extra promise to pay. So at this point is the original exchange of promises, but in response to this offer for extra money, we don't get anything from the band. And again, a student might leave it there, and the answer would be a bit lacking, because of course we've got another however. It's possible to say that when they do agree to play for this extra money, they're using this Williams versus Roffey principle, or that becomes relevant, because now she's avoiding the detriment. They're allowing their agreement to play, after all, avoids the detriment to Sally of having to cancel the event or go through a lot of hassle in reorganising it or whatever. And that's that Williams versus Roffey case. You see that a lot. It's a principle that seems to find its way into a lot of problem questions. And a further point could be that they might be going beyond their original duty by agreeing, after all, because they're actually travelling further than perhaps they originally anticipated or agreed. Williams again. And then your little conclusion, perhaps not quite so certain this time. That's fine, you're not the judge. You're just the lawyer identifying the legal points. So if you do a little conclusion, you could just say that the additional money promised on this latter basis may be claimable. So that's the second bit dealt with. Not too much writing. If you've done the AO1 to begin with, you don't need to repeat any law. You just need to refer to the law that you said earlier, show how it applies to this scenario, and then perhaps just re-quote the case that you're getting this principle from in brackets at the end of your statement. And the third and final issue is it carries on, and Sally's now worried about the equipment that's going to be left at the leisure centre overnight. So it's all very predictable. You keep seeing different variations of this. So she offers to pay Danny, a local police officer, to do extra patrols the night before the party, and he agrees. And again, you say, oh, well, so what? Well, the issue is, is the consideration in this third issue, because the whole thing is a consideration question. So in relation to Danny, the first thing that Sally does is offer him money, and there's Sally's consideration, a standard offer of money for his services, and his services would be good consideration in response. So it appears okay to begin with, but then of course the however is, well, hang on a minute, he's got an existing duty to be a police officer anyway, because that's his job, that's his public duty. And that Collins versus Godfrey case would say that, well, if he's being a policeman anyway, and it's his responsibility to be a policeman, he's not providing any consideration for her offer of money, because you've got to do it anyway. So there's your first point. And then you think, again, as some students might leave it there and be a bit limited on the marks that they earn. But you think about, oh, could there be any exceptions to this? Is there any way around this? Is there anything else to say? And there is another however, because and this probably would have possibly got a mention in your AO1, and we're now just applying it. It's possible to exceed one's public duty or contractual duty, by the way, if that's the scenario that you're looking at in your problem question. You can exceed your public duty by doing something beyond what you're already obliged to do. And it does say that he's doing extra patrols, and that would indicate that he's going beyond what he is obliged to do automatically. That's that Glasbrook case about striking minors, I believe. And for that reason, this extra money